Okay, so welcome on our AsyncAPI public meeting. This meeting, like every other meeting, is recorded. So just please be advised that whatever you say is going to stay there forever on YouTube. So we have several topics on the agenda, but I also think I saw a few new names on the list of the participants. So folks, that's a moment for you. If you'd like to introduce yourself to the group, you don't have to, but you're most welcome to do that. I mean, I'd like to meet you, for example. So anyone from the new joiners like to say something?
Hello, I think I am the new joiner. So myself is Aman. I'm from Melbourne, Australia, and I work as solution architect for a finance company called Mulamani. So we are like in the growth phase and re-architecting our monolith code base and having a lot of asynchronous services. And so I came to know about AsyncAPI a few months ago. And from there, I joined this group and Slack channel.
Awesome, welcome. So another proof that it makes sense to make a call at such an early hour for us, but enabling Australia also to join. Awesome, welcome. Anyone else like to say something? Okay, so before we jump into the items that I've put there, and also Sergio and Jonas wanted to have, do anyone from the people that joined, the newcomers and the old comers, I'm not sure if it's even correct word, anyone has a question, so you don't want to wait until the end of the meeting, because the meeting is for the community. So if somebody has a question, doesn't want to wait until we cover the other topics, that's the moment where you can shoot your question or just wait. It's up to you. Okay, cool. So let's continue. So I have two topics, quick topics, I guess, just a highlight for you. So long story short, last year we applied for, I mean, we did not apply. You don't have to apply for Hacktoberfest, but we were pretty active in Hacktoberfest. We got feedback from Hacktoberfest participants that we should.
It's just disappeared for me. Is it just me?
Who disappeared for you? Me? Gerald? Can you hear me, guys?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay, so let's go back. So we got a tremendous feedback that with our engagement, we should also go with Google Summer of Code. And now we're in Google Summer of Code. And I'd like just to say, remind whoever, and I see Ace joined. Hi, Ace. So we have a few folks already joined Slack, discussed with us the ideas that we had for Google Summer of Code. So here it's just a reminder that today is a deadline for, why it's called deadline? Nobody's dying. So it's a deadline for today to submit your proposals. Then we have a month to accept them. So only a few hours left. So Ace, if you didn't do it yet, go to Google.
What is Google Summer of Code? I've heard many things and I'm not really very familiar with it.
So it's a super cool initiative from Google that engages open source community and students around the world to work together on some ideas. So for example, we had a list of ideas for tools for AsyncAPI, like a AsyncAPI div, or some crazy idea about having a chatbot that can help you out creating your own AsyncAPI file. And we had a few of all those ideas. And then we go to Google saying we want to apply for Google Summer of Code. We have a number of ideas. And then students around the world, they can go through all those different projects, their ideas, pick some, join the given initiative, propose that they will solve it for us. We say, yeah, we accept your proposal, let's go forward. Then we mentor such a student, like explain the project, explain how to work with us, and basically on board on open source, all the like from coding to communication, etc. And then at the end, we give feedback. And once work is done, I believe there's a kind of sponsorship from Google. Then, like I think Google pays 1.5K bucks for the student for the work that he's done, but I'm not 100% sure it's 1.5.
Nice. So effectively, it's a way to get parts of the open source project in the hands of students and get them to develop it with some remuneration to make sure it's, you know, at least reasonably above board.
Yeah. So
cool. That sounds great.
And then it's also an option for long-term hire, I guess, as well.
Yeah, and there's a kind of mentorship part to it as well, isn't there? I think.
Yeah. Mentorship is a key here. Like it starts from the very beginning. So discussion over the proposal. So it's for me, it's awesome because you kind of show students like the whole path from working on the idea, discussing idea in open source, in like with the community, then going through the implementation, pull request review, like adjustments, etc. You show them like how the communication works in open source. So it's I wish I knew about it when I was studying. So
me too. Sounds
so,
yeah, great fun.
Yeah, but it's our first time, so let's see how it's gonna it's gonna work. I think it ends in August, so we're gonna have some cool tools at the end of August and more feedback. Ace, you want to add something to what I said? Now I force you to say something. No, you don't want to? Okay, no worries. And now we jump to another topic that actually involves Ace. So for example, Ace is one of the students that came up with one of the proposals, but also jumped into other issues and things we could do already for AsyncAPI. And we now, for your information, on our website, and thanks to Ace implementation, we have an easy way for you to also post job offers for AsyncAPI community members. So when you go to asyncapi.com/jobs, there's a pretty easy instruction and that you can follow to submit your job proposals. You can do it through the GitHub UI or just as the usual fork, pull request flow. So yeah, I guess like Google Summer of Code works pretty well. Thanks, Ace. So that's it from my side, and I guess not sure if it's you, Jose, or Jose, Jonas. Oh my God, Jose. Maybe you, Jonas, or Sergio. Do you want to introduce the topics that you suggested in the comments for the agenda?
Yeah, I can start. Not Jose. Okay, so I'm gonna start first because Jonas just literally told me a few minutes ago that it would be better to introduce what the intent-driven API for the parser means. So Jonathan and I are working on an intent-driven API for the parser, not just for the JavaScript one, yet for a global API for any parser, even though we are starting with the JavaScript one, because we don't have any other parser with feature parity linked to the current spec person. So anyway, what does intent-driven API means? So we figured it out that the current parser had some issues, the API on the parser. I'm gonna share my screen, I guess, very quickly, if you allow me. No, I can host disabled participant screen sharing.
Yeah, no worries. I'm gonna give you just a second. You're now a co-host.
Whoa.
You have power.
The power. Okay, so everything started here. Fran suggested that we have some problems in the current API. Some of them are related to not having a API that represents the intentions of the users. And rather, we have a API that it's a representation of the spec structure. So that means that whenever the spec changes, we introduce any breaking change or we add new feature, whatever, that API also breaks. So yeah, I'm gonna share this later, the links of the issues, basically because Zoom is a bit hard to do when you are sharing screen.
Sorry, before you continue, when you say API, you mean the JavaScript API exposed by the parser, correct?
Yeah, the library API.
Right, okay.
Oh, okay, cool. Good clarification there.
Sorry. Yeah, that's what I meant with it's not only for the JavaScript API, like the JavaScript library, it's for any parser. We have the Golang one, which is under development. It will also follow the same API. So any parser we create in any language will have to follow this new API, right? What does it mean, intents? So here we already started working on it and we defined some of them. So just for a quick example, we have intents translated into functions, which means like, if I want to have all the channels that are publishable by the application, and here application and client, I don't know if you are aware that we had some discussions around the point of view of the spec. So there are some open issues that suggest that we might want to introduce a new concept of the role or point of view or X, because we didn't decide what. Because sometimes you want to use the spec from the point of view of a client, but also from the application, where application could be, I don't know, a simple server or a cluster of Kafka or a broker, whatever. So those intents, what are doing is just trying to reduce the friction on getting, for example, in this case, channels. So you don't have to know what kind of operation it's behind, because it's going to be explained by itself in the function. So you don't have to access the whole structure until you find all the operations that are published. But instead, you will have all of them just by calling this method. And if we follow all the functions declared, it's going to be a similar behavior. So, for example, we have the same intents for client perspective. So let's say I'm a client that want to use the parser, and I just need to know all the channels I can publish to, right? I don't have to know if we mean publish from the point of view of the application, or we mean subscribe, because this is an issue that whenever you start on AsyncAPI, the first thing you think about is like, what is publish and what is subscribe, right? From which point of view we are talking about. So this is already resolved as well by those intents, as you can see.
So just to clarify for a second, this is effectively the objective here is to abstract away from all implementation details, whether it's spec or otherwise, and basically say these are the operations we're trying to achieve, whether it's a publish, so a message is going from A to B or from B to A, and have it in terms of the actual message operations rather than in terms of implementation detail of a protocol or of a spec or of a language. Would that be correct?
Yeah, that's correct. In fact, talking about implementation, so you can imagine this as just a simple mapping between that could change between versions. So users of the parser won't have that much breaking change because we will handle that directly inside those functions. So meaning if channels become, let's say in the spec, we move operations to live in the root object or in the root document, users of the parser won't have to change anything because the parser will handle those changes for them, right? So it doesn't matter where the operations live with this API, because we will handle that inside inside each of the functions, right? It's just changing the mapping.
Okay, so it's like a compiler front. So you're basically defining a compiler front end and then having changeable backends. So I'm trying to put it in terms of things I've built before.
Yeah, we could talk about it. Yeah,
cool. That's really good. It's a really nice move.
So what about those objects that are being returned here, like channel and message? Are they nested? So does the channel object have a link to the operations on that channel, which has a link to the messages?
Yeah, you can have here. Those are not all the functions that we'll have. Okay, those are just the most important related to intents.
I see.
But you have an example here for channel, so you can get the operations from a channel. You can get the messages and the binding extension, etc., etc.
But then what you said before doesn't really hold, no? Because if operations move out of channels, for instance, they would also have to be removed from here, I suppose.
It's not like that, because in that particular case, an operation is going to be always linked to a channel, right? So we are not talking here about the structure of the object. It doesn't mean that channel has a field called operation.
Okay, understood. Yeah, it's just the simple connection between that channel and its operations, regardless of where they are defined in the spec.
Yeah, that's the point. What we did also is that we try to, for building this is just a draft of the suggestion we wanted to do. We also created some possible changes in the spec based on issues that the community created. So, for example, so there is an issue where we could potentially add support for multiple message schema format. So what we try is to get some of those issues with spec suggestions and try to create what we think it could work. This is fake, I'll put it here, but we try to create several of those that introduce breaking changes in the spec and see how they behave with the new API. So our goal was to not break the API with any of those breaking changes. And there are some breaking changes like the one we said, moving operations from, I think it's, sorry for the mess. As you can see here, operations is in the root document, right? So operations are linked to channels and to messages, but still the API won't break. We can still call the same methods and the users of the parser won't have to change anything. So yeah, don't take a lot of like, this is just fake possible changes. It was just to provide some scenarios that could make the API work break. Okay, so having said that, do you have any question about the intent-driven API?
How different is this to the API currently exposed by the parser?
Yeah, so the current API basically it's completely linked to the object behind the spec document.
I see.
So in case you want to access, let's use this, the summary of an operation, you will have to access the operations, somehow access this operation, and then get the summary. But just following the same structure as the document, like the same functions, order, mapping to the document will be like AsyncAPI operations let's say online measure summary. You know,
it's even more complex. So it's actually AsyncAPI channel and the channel name, then .publish or .subscribe, then So it's reflecting the structure exactly.
And excuse my ignorance, but is the current JavaScript parser the most widely used way of parsing async API documents?
Yes.
I see.
Yeah, this is being used for for example, all the templates use the parser, right, through the generator. But you could also use it on your own, like as a client, you want to validate your messages or whatever, and you want to use the parser. In fact, there is another project that I'm working on, not in parallel, but it's the event gateway or the event proxy, which will need to use the parser for validating messages. So that's the reason I also moved my effort to work on this.
Let me just clarify what I'm asking. So essentially, in the community, everyone who's potentially interested in async API, do they typically use that one JavaScript parser? Or is it likely that other parsers have been developed which would not benefit from this work?
No, there is only this JavaScript one. There is a Golang one, but it's under development. So yeah, we only have the JavaScript one.
If it comes to the ones under AsyncAPI organization, of course, there are some others like MuleSoft, I think, has two, one for Java and one for JavaScript. But if it comes to AsyncAPI GitHub organization and all the tooling that we do, like 100%, whenever we need to parse AsyncAPI document, it's with the JavaScript parser.
We have our own JavaScript parser, but it's once again, it's JavaScript and it's based on yours. So
yeah.
Okay. So that was the introduction. What we wanted to talk about, Jonathan, it was about those two issues here that are kind of related. The first one is this one that Maciek created. Maciek is not in the call, so I'm not gonna be focused a lot on this. But we can just do a brief summary. So the idea is to support JSON schema on the bindings, meaning we could validate the bindings. We could use the bindings models in templates. And it seems, I'm not aware of this, I'm still learning, but it seems it could also help for rendering correctly the components on the templates, the React templates. The point here is, it sounds like cool and good to go, but the thing is that we have to consider several things here to move. We have to store somewhere the JSON schemas, right? There are some suggestions Maciek did here, like putting them in the bindings repository and probably link from the spec to those files directly whenever we validate the document, or rather, I think Maciek was suggesting to use another approach here, which I'm not very aware. But anyway, the point is that that's the concept. We want to add validations. There are more things to consider. And here is why I mentioned this issue, which is not completely related, but kind of, and it's the version. Bindings have their own version, right? We keep versioning on the bindings, which means we could introduce a breaking change in between binding versions, like renaming a field or something like this. And that means that the document will change as well. So with this, and coming back to the intent-driven API, we also have to somehow get the bindings into the parser's API, the intent-driven API. And we still have the same issue. So how do we know which version our parser is going to be compatible with? Version talking about binding version. How do we keep compatibility between the parser and the bindings? So here is a like big thing. Let me.
I believe there is no standard way in the spec to specify the version of a binding. If so, you can only, the binding is for a protocol. No, let's say channel binding for AMQP, but the version of that AMQP binding that is being used has no standard place in the spec. Is that correct?
Every binding should have a property attribute that is called binding version.
Binding version, yeah.
So there is, I mean, every binding has to have one. So you can specify which binding version you're using in your binding object.
But by default, it's just the newest version. So if you haven't specified anything, the newest version is just assumed.
Yeah. So so how it looks now from the parser point of view, bindings is just kind of key value structure. They are a schema, but they are treated like a black box. It doesn't know about what is behind. So it's whatever it comes, I return it to the parser function call, right? So if I call bindings from this message, it's gonna just return whatever it has. It doesn't have any intent. It doesn't have extra functions. It's just getters to the fields under the binding, which is not a problem. It's just a possibility. So here in this issue, we are adding some example of how the parser could help or could handle breaking changes on the binding versions. But first, let's start with an example of what we are talking about here. So let's say MQP binding version 1.00 introduces a breaking change where the field method returns an array of possible methods instead of, sorry, I think, oh, this is wrong. I didn't mean that. It's not the MQP, it's the WebSocket one. Anyway, so the WebSocket binding, instead of returning a method, which is post and get, I think. Let me open just in case, because I don't remember. Where is this one? Yes. So here is returning just a string. So let's say we introduce a breaking change where instead of one string, we return several, or an array. I don't mind why the reasons behind that, but just try to believe that. And so this meaning that the current use of the parser will look like this: the binding dot method will have to be changed or to adapt to getting, instead of one field, to have an array. If we also introduce a new change, like moving the method to live under another, like a subtype or subchild called request, it means that we will have also to change the code to be like this: binding.request.method, whatever. So this is the breaking change. This is quite related to what we were talking about previously, what the intents API try to solve here, nothing new. The point here is, it's not just about writing the intents or not. It's just how the parser API can support those versions, and at the same time be like resilient to those breaking changes introduced by the new versions. So you cannot only point to one version, right? You cannot only say, yeah, the parser only uses WebSocket binding version 1.00, because the spec document could be like using the binding 0.2.0. So you have to keep support for several versions. And this is like a problem. How do we do that? Sorry for the mess explaining this, but I didn't have a good night. Any question here? So is the problem understood? Like, from the parser's point of view, we can not just stick with only one binding version. We have to give support for several eventually.
I think what you're trying to do with your intent-driven API to the parser is you anticipate changes, future changes to the spec, and you try to make the parser API basically agnostic or forward compatible with those changes to the spec. I think that's all right when it comes to the spec, but you can't anticipate all the changes to all the bindings that can possibly be invented. So I would give up on intent-driven for the binding objects. I would just treat them literally, parse them literally as they are represented in the spec, in the AsyncAPI document. And so I think if we can accept that, then the problem just comes down to being able to look up the JSON schema for a given protocol, for a given version of the binding for that protocol. So being able to look up the JSON schema document for AMQP binding version 100 and have your parser return the literal parsing output of that binding object. How does that sound?
Yeah, actually, what you're suggesting is the option one. I think it's kind of like keep it like it is now, right? Like,
right now we don't have a way of looking up a JSON schema document for a binding version, do we?
Oh, you mean like supporting a particular, like from the parser call? So the user that uses the parser specify the version you want to use for parsing? Is that what you mean? Like you specify the binding?
If what Lucas has said before is correct, that every binding should have a binding version, no? Then when you come to the node in your AsyncAPI document that says channel so binding AMQP, then binding version 100, you must look up this JSON schema for AMQP binding definition 100. If you then have a way to look up that schema document, you can validate and parse. That was my suggestion.
Okay.
So
yeah,
oh, sorry, Jonas. No, continue.
So yeah, this is great when we want to validate things, right? And this is exactly what we should be using it for. The problem at hand here is about making sure that tooling does not have to change when the bindings behind the scenes changes and all the structure of the bindings. And And this is kind of a problem with when a binding has their own version that's separated from the spec completely, how can we keep a compatibility matrix in the parsers to ensure that this version of the parser works with these bindings, for example? There's different approaches as outlined here as well. Because at the moment in tooling, if you want to access a binding, you need to know exactly the structure of the object that's returned. The parser doesn't help you in any way. It just gives you an object and says, this can be any object. Try and figure out what the hell is in this binding object. So you have to, from the tooling side, you have to know exactly what's in bindings. And if binding changes, then you are, I don't want to say obligated, but if you want to keep compatibility with newer versions, you have to change your code. It's a problem, which is why we want to introduce these intents basically for the bindings.
I see. Example of tooling being a code generator using your parser, correct? If that code generator finds an AsyncAPI version 100 channel binding object, it must know what to do with that. But there's no way around that. No, it can't. Not everything can be generic. I think at some point, specific code has to be written.
True,
yeah.
Then we can just give you a converter and that converts to the latest.
Yeah.
It's not about converting, because at the end, so the users here are, let's say, templates. Okay, so templates are using the parser, and templates will have to handle these breaking changes, and it's fine. We can move with that, and it's fine. Even though we could avoid somehow, but let's say it's fine. The point is that you need to know whenever you ask the, so you know the compatibility of your template. You know that you only work with the binding version X. The point is that you can have, like we said, you ask the parser to return whatever they have, and you manage everything on your own. Or rather, you tell the parser how the parser should parse it, or which version of the binding should use. We could also do that, right? And everything that returns the parser will be known as well by the template. And we could also introduce intents-driven API there. We could keep it. Even though that's like a hard move, it's not that easy. And this is like, we have to find a balance between complexity and, I would say, usability here. So anyway, everything it's, we put some options here to try to fix that issue. The second option was to just tie the binding versions to the spec version. So meaning every time a binding releases, the spec does as well. I know that's like a lot, because for any change, let's say we release a new version on the AsyncAPI binding. So why should I update the spec, right? If just a small change on the binding. The third option is also related to this, but it's completely moving the bindings to be part of the spec and not having their own release cycle. So everything in the same release cycle, which is very similar to the option 2. With those options, what I imagine behind that as a technical solution, since the parser only supports some spec versions, will mean that it will also support those binding versions that the spec supports, right? So at the end, we have the same contract between the spec and the bindings versions. The big cons here is that we are going to do a lot of releases on the spec, which I think it's not very good. And the good point of the bindings is that they have their own release cycle, right? So they can add changes and they can release major or minors without even affecting the spec.
Yeah, I think option 2 is impossible. No, bindings will only get more and will change for arbitrary reasons. No, and another flag to drive a code generator might be introduced in a binding, and so I don't think what option 2 is wise.
Yeah, I knew that. Then we have the option.
I'm just chiming in. No, I don't.
Yeah, it's good. I mean,
just voicing an opinion. That's all.
No, but we try to put all the options that came to our mind because it's good to have all of them here. Option 4, on the other hand, it goes a bit farther and adds a bit of complexity, technically speaking. But the idea is that the bindings provide their own parser library. Like the same we talked at the beginning, like they provide their own JSON schema for validating. They could also provide their own parser library, their own package. In that case, the JavaScript package. So whenever you call the parser, you can tell the parser, okay, use this package or whatever function this package provides to you following an interface for parsing the binding. So meaning that in this case, the template will always know what the parser will return to them. And in that case, we could also keep intents and not depend on the structure behind. Meaning that we could add extra functions to all the bindings and make helpers inside each binding. Maintainers could add more functionality on their own bindings, right? They won't be anymore just a container of key values. Obviously, this is like adding more complexity.
And it adds more work for binding authors. No, they also have to implement your plugin essentially to the parser.
Yes.
Which is not that bad if it's such an important parser and so widely used. And it kind of makes sense because we also do a kind of plugin support for parsing the different schema formats, right? So we have a parser, but we have a plugin for Avro schema parser. So you can plug in to the parser, and then the parser is able to parse your AsyncAPI document that includes a Avro schemas inside. So this flexibility is in the parser. So long term, having it for the binding doesn't sound like something super strange, I would say, but time consuming. To be honest, like my view is like option 1, definitely, because as you can already see, the bindings add a complexity, super huge complexity to the intent API, where it's our first approach to the idea of intent API. So my challenge question would be like, does it make sense to really try to solve it looking at the bindings and their current version? Because I think it's okay to say that bindings is something that is not yet stable. I don't think we have any single binding that reached 1.0. Many of them missing full-time maintainers, and they are subject for change. Like they can change however they want until they reach 1.0. So my opinion here, I think it's better to keep it as it is with the parser. So you just get the whole binding, and that's it. And then see how the intent API evolves, and then try to like push those best practices that we have in the intent API and try to map them to bindings once we are like ready to do it actually with the bindings.
So option one, what Jonas just described as essentially the binding object is returned as an object, and then it's for the tool for the tooling implementation to discover what properties that object has.
Yeah, and that's what we can currently. That's the only thing we can currently do because we don't have schemas for bindings. We don't have a solution in place where we can we don't generate models for those bindings that we can. I mean, there's no way we can guess what's the type of the data that we return. So we return objects.
But why does it rule out validating against the schema?
It does not. It's the validation should still be in place. It's only on the tooling side that you don't have a direct API to call. Or no.
I think that's my preferred option as well. Go with option one to start with, and then when the intent-based API parser has been proven for the core spec, we look at option 4. And it comes to a quick question about, obviously this is very early in the process, but how this would be implemented. Are we thinking of hard coding the mappings between the intent side of the API and the spec? Or are we thinking of maybe doing it with CodeGen and a DSL or something like that? Because I can see this being very useful for OpenAPI as well as AsyncAPI. And I would like it to be a generic process, if possible.
We already, I think Maciek suggested to us a few weeks ago to use like JSON mapping between versioning. But by now we discarded, and by now we are gonna just hard code the mapping. Yeah, I mean, the point is that, let me explain. So we want to validate the API as soon as possible. And for validating, we need the API to be like available, like in a alpha or whatever version as soon as possible out, right? If we go into this mapping detail, like internal implementation details, which is good. I mean, it's a super good suggestion. This is gonna be lowering us, and we prefer to invest this time on redefining the API whenever it's needed, rather than technical details, right? Like let's say all those, sorry, I don't know what is now. All the intents that I showed before are wrong, maybe, right? So maybe users say, yeah, this is not useful at all, and we have to redefine this, or we have to add new ones, whatever. So we prefer to invest the time on that. And once it's validated, I think we are gonna be all fine with that. I don't know what you mean. What do you think about it? If it makes sense, this approach.
Oh, yeah, definitely get the surface area, the intent-based API exactly right first, and then think about how we implement it. But if I can just put out the idea of making it a generic process, or maybe using CodeGen or something like that, because I would love to be able to do this for OpenAPI and OpenRPC as well, and JSON schema itself.
Yeah, it's an important note, right?
Yeah.
Because it is open source and we are community driven, right?
Yeah.
So if you have the intent of doing the same with OpenAPI, why not make a collaboration on exactly this issue of implementing an intent API?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have the intention, but I do now.
Exactly. So if that's what, not that we want, but if that's what is what can you say? Not expected, but wanted. Yeah, we can do that in the implementation.
I just need to go and grab the door, so I'll be back in a minute.
No worries. But yeah, I think that kind of just to summarize, the goal here is the API, not how it's implemented. And then once we are super happy with the API, then we can, then we actually will jump into the final implementation But yeah, we need to remember that.
Yeah, definitely. At the end, it's like, I think it's the way to go at the end, maintaining this between versions and handling breaking changes on the parser. It's harder if you hard code everything. So it could be a mess in terms of code.
But it can be a mess auto-generating things as well and making the mapping. Right. So it will definitely create some kind of complexity, but maybe worth it.
Because the point is not only the mapping, so there are more things behind. If it would be only mapping that change between versions, it's hard. It's like easy to do, but it would be like not only mapping. Like there are several changes that can be introduced in the spec that cannot be represented by changes on the mapping, and then you have to add extra support for that. It's like that's why we didn't move on that direction in the first iteration. Yeah, but totally, it's worth.
There's definitely a mapping process and a transformation process that might be involved, both of which could be done without hard coding. But I appreciate you might want to get a proof of concept out earlier.
Do we agree that your intent-driven API will still need to change with future versions of the spec? No, for instance, let's say a new field is introduced on a channel that says, is it point-to-point or publish-subscribe? No, that will require a change to your intent-driven API, won't it?
Yeah,
totally.
I mean, any changes to the spec in terms of adding properties or creating new objects or whatever it is, it creates a change to the parser, right? Without a doubt, we can't get around that. We can
and to the API exposed by the parser, no? Because that channel object will have a new field, for instance.
Exactly. Yeah. And from the parser's point of view, right, it's just a feature change. Basically, it's just a minor version change. And even major version changes in the spec does not necessarily result in a major version change of the parser, meaning that if you create tooling using this parser, you don't have to change anything. You just have to bump the parser version, and then you support the newest AsyncAPI version, for example. And this is basically the entire, what's it called? The outcome of this intent API, right?
Okay, and this way we came to the end of the meeting. We have 1 minute left. Anyone has a question? If somebody was waiting until the end of the meeting, it's a good tip for the future to ask questions before we start talking. But yeah, if anyone has some questions, you know our Slack. Most of you, I think, are already in our Slack. Then please join and ask us in a synchronous way on Slack. We're responsive there, so we're gonna answer your questions there as well. And the next meeting we have again in 2 weeks, and this time it's gonna be America's friendly, which is 4 p.m. UTC. And remember about change time zone change, whatever is the name. Thanks for joining. And let's hope Fran had a good night. Wasn't waking up too often. Cheers.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye.